nuclear arms race was between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This was an arms race. An arms race is when two or more countries stockpile weapons in order to gain an advantage, militarily and politically. This led to great tensions throughout the world, and the threat of a nuclear Armageddon became real. This first started when the United States received word of a possible threat of a German atomic bomb. So, in response, they created the Manhattan Project to create the first nuclear weapon. This would prove a success, as on July 16, 1945, Robert J. Oppenheimer and the team at Los Alamos, New Mexico, created the first nuclear weapon. This was a bomb as powerful as 18.6 kilotons of TNT. By 1945, World War II was almost over, but the last Axis power was still left, which was the Japanese Empire, and so Harry S. Truman ordered the atomic bomb to be used against the Japanese. On August 6, 1945, the United States would drop the atomic bomb named Little Boy onto Hiroshima, which would claim a total of 100,000 Japanese lives. But the Japanese did not surrender, and so on August 9, 1945, the United States would drop another atomic bomb named Fat Man onto Nagasaki, claiming an estimate of at least 70,000 Japanese lives. Soon after, the Japanese would surrender on September 2, 1945, ending World War II. But conflicts would not end there, as the world had just been introduced to the atomic bomb, setting off the nuclear arms race. Now the Cold War had begun, and the Soviet Union needed to catch up to the United States in terms of nuclear warfare. And so, on August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union would successfully test their first atomic bomb, called RDS-1, or First Lightning. This bomb would yield power of 22 kilotons of TNT. This would cement the Soviet Union into the arms race and cause further tensions. Now the arms race had begun, and both countries wanted to create the biggest and baddest bombs. On November 1st, 1952, the United States would create Ivy Mike, the first hydrogen bomb with a power of 10 megatons of TNT. On August 12, 1953, the Soviet Union would create RDS-6, their first hydrogen bomb with a power of 400 kilotons of TNT. On March 1st, 1954, the United States would create their most powerful bomb, the Shrimp, with a power of 15 megatons of TNT. On November 22, 1955, the Soviet Union would create the RDS-37, atomic bomb with a power of 1.6 megatons of TNT. The arms race would not stop there, as the introduction of the ICBM would change warfare forever. ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. It is a ballistic missile with a range of 5,500 kilometers. This would send nuclear warheads farther and quicker than ever before. And on August 21st, 1957, the Soviet Union would create the first ICBM, RC Semyorka. And in response, to July 28, 1959, the United States would create the SM-65 Atlas, America's first ICBM. Soon, the arms race would show just how dangerous it really was. In October of 1962, despite warnings from President Kennedy not to introduce offensive weapons into Cuba, on October 14th, a U.S. spy plane would find nuclear missile sites in Cuba. And so, in response, on October 22nd, Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba. The term quarantine is important. It avoids the term blockade, which would assume a state of war. Soon after, on October 24th, the leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, would say that the blockade was an act of aggression. Therefore, Soviet ships would be allowed to enter into Cuba. Despite this, some Soviet ships would turn back from the quarantine, as others were allowed to pass because they were not carrying offensive weapons. By October 26th, the United States was in DEFCON 2 and ready to act. Despite this, President Kennedy gave more time to diplomacy, which would prove to be a good move, as later that evening he would receive a message from Khrushchev stating that he wanted to avoid nuclear holocaust. After messages between the two leaders, on October 28th, Khrushchev would make a public message claiming the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. The crisis had been averted, but the threat of nuclear war became real. Now, diplomacy was on the table, and under President Nixon, the SALT Treaty and the ABM Treaty would be signed. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, and ABM stands for Anti-Ballistic Missiles. These treaties will limit ABM's anti-ballistic missiles defense systems to 200 for each country, and will also limit the number of ballistic missile launchers. Soon after, further negotiations would follow for a second SALT treaty to address the MITRVs, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. These are payloads which contain multiple nuclear warheads, which can make defense difficult. And finally, under President Carter, the SALT II treaty would be signed, limiting MIRVs, delivery vehicles, and other nuclear forces. Years and years of a constant back and forth race between the Soviet Union and the United States would finally come to an end, as by the 1980s the Soviet Union was extremely poor and its citizens were extremely unhappy. And so, on December 25th, their leader, Gorbachev, would resign, and then finally, on December 31st, 1991, the Soviet Union would fall, finally ending the Cold War and the nuclear arms race.